September 1941. Inside a polished wooden conference room in Tokyo, a man stood before Japan's most powerful naval officers. His name was Major General Minoru Genda, a calm, analytical mind whose confidence was matched only by his precision. Genda wasn't a dreamer or an ideologue. He wasn't driven by empire or emotion. He was, above all else, a technician, a man who believed that wars were won not by passion, but by calculation. And on that morning, he presented what he believed to be the most perfect calculation of his life, the plan to strike Pearl Harbor. He spoke of mathematics, of ranges, fuel capacities, attack angles, and aircraft payloads. He described the vulnerability of American battleships at anchor, the timing of dive bomber descents, the probability of torpedo hits in shallow waters. He had modeled every variable. Every risk had been quantified, every contingency mapped. And when he finished, the room was silent, not out of doubt, but in awe. Because to the men who heard him that day, the logic was flawless. If America's Pacific Fleet could be crippled in one blow, Japan would dominate Asia before the United States could recover. The empire would expand from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, capturing the oil, the rubber, and the metals that would make Japan self-sufficient. By the time America's shipyards could replace what had been lost, it would be too late. Negotiations would come. Peace, on Japanese terms, would follow. 6 months. That was the window Genda calculated. 6 months of Japanese dominance before the industrial weight of the United States could possibly awaken. And in those 6 months, he believed, Japan could secure everything it needed to make victory inevitable. But there was one variable Genda didn't calculate, because it couldn't be expressed in numbers or diagrams. It wasn't about tactics or technology. It was about will. He could measure the radius of a torpedo's turn. He could compute the rate of dive bomb descent, but he could not measure the depth of a nation's resolve once attacked. And when he finally understood what he had overlooked, it was far too late. Minoru Genda had been born in 1904 in Hiroshima, a city that decades later would come to symbolize the cost of war. From his youth, he was methodical, exacting, brilliant with machines. He entered the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service and quickly earned a reputation as one of the most disciplined tactical minds in Japan. By the late 1930s, his ascent was inevitable. He was not a man of charisma or politics. He rose through sheer competence. And by 1940, as Japan edged toward open conflict with the West, Genda had become the architect of possibility under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. Yamamoto, the reluctant warrior, the Harvard-educated realist, understood what many in Tokyo did not. He knew America's power, its resources, its population, and above all, its industrial potential. He knew that war with the United States was a gamble against time. But Yamamoto also knew that Japan's fate was no longer his to choose. The tide of militarism had swept the country. To oppose it was treason. To hesitate was weakness. So he resolved to make the gamble as devastatingly efficient as possible. And for that, he turned to Genda. Genda's assignment was not to question the war. It was to make it work. He was the man who would translate Yamamoto's daring into numbers and blueprints. His task to determine whether the unthinkable, a carrier-based surprise attack across 4,000 miles of ocean, could actually succeed. And Genda's answer, after months of planning, was yes. Could Japan's carrier aircraft reach Hawaii without detection? Yes, if they took a northern route through the winter fogs of the North Pacific. Could torpedoes be used in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters without burying themselves in the mud? Yes, if redesigned with wooden fins to control their descent. Could 6 carriers be coordinated to launch hundreds of planes in precise waves of destruction? Yes, if timing, wind direction, and flight patterns were synchronized down to the minute. Every detail had been solved. Every obstacle had been conquered by calculation. It was, by every measure, a masterpiece of military engineering. And yet, beneath the precision, cracks were already forming, invisible but fatal, because Genda's world was one of equations. He believed victory was a product of input and output, the sum of efficiency, surprise, and courage. He did not see war for what it truly was, an economic organism, a struggle of nations' entire lifeblood, factories, farms, railways, and mines. When he presented the final plan in September 1941, he spoke with conviction. The numbers were irrefutable. America would take months to rebuild. The Pacific Fleet would be shattered. Public morale would crumble. Japan would negotiate from strength. The logic was airtight. The faith in calculation, absolute. But the unseen truth, the one no Japanese planner could comprehend, was that America's strength did not lie in its ships or its bases. It lay in its capacity to create, and that capacity had not yet even stirred. December 7th, 1941. At dawn, 6 Japanese carriers turned into the wind. The sea was calm, the sky clear. The first wave of aircraft roared into the air. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters. 183 planes in perfect formation. They came out of the morning sky, low and fast. The American sailors at Pearl Harbor had no warning. Within minutes, the harbor was engulfed in fire. Battleships burned. Explosions shook the bay. Arizona split in half. Oklahoma capsized. Over 2,000 Americans were dead. From the deck of the carrier Akagi, Genda watched reports flood in. His plan had worked perfectly. The timing, the coordination, the destruction. All exactly as calculated. He had delivered the blow that Japan's leaders had dreamed of. For a brief, radiant moment, it seemed the empire had defied history. In Tokyo, newspapers declared the Pacific Fleet destroyed. Crowds filled the streets, chanting Banzai for Yamamoto and the Emperor. Japan had seized destiny. The 6-month window had begun. But in shipyards, thousands of miles away, in San Francisco, Seattle, Newport News, and Norfolk, a different kind of awakening was underway. Because Pearl Harbor did not cripple America, it united it. Factories that had been building cars, farm tools, and radios began converting overnight. Ford's massive Willow Run plant would soon turn out a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Kaiser shipyards would launch Liberty ships faster than the Japanese could sink them. Genda had calculated damage. He had not calculated determination. The attack had not destroyed the Pacific Fleet's carriers. They were at sea that morning. The attack had not silenced America's industry. It had ignited it. Within weeks, production quotas tripled. New shipyards opened. New training programs launched. Men enlisted. Women entered factories by the millions. America was not stunned. It was mobilized. And that was the one force Genda had never modeled. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed unstoppable. City after city, island after island, the empire's flag rose over territories that had once belonged to the Western powers. Hong Kong fell. Singapore, once hailed as Britain's Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in humiliation. The Dutch East Indies, rich in oil and rubber, were seized. The Philippines, defended by General Douglas MacArthur, collapsed under siege. To the Japanese people, it appeared that Genda's plan had not only worked, it had changed history. But behind the triumphant headlines, the empire was already beginning to strain. Every victory stretched supply lines farther. Every new conquest demanded ships, fuel, and men to occupy and defend it. And for every resource seized, more was consumed trying to protect it. Genda's calculations had delivered a stunning tactical victory, but Japan's strategic position was detained, deteriorating by the day. Because unlike America, Japan had no industrial depth. Its factories were small, its raw materials imported, its machinery limited. Each bomber lost over Pearl Harbor had been a significant fraction of Japan's total production capacity. Each trained pilot was irreplaceable, and in Tokyo, few dared to admit it. Genda had believed that Japan's advantage lay in quality: better pilots, superior tactics, faster aircraft, unmatched naval coordination. For a time, it was true. In early 1942, Japanese Zero fighters dominated the skies. American pilots called them ghosts: fast, agile, deadly. In the jungles of Burma and the coral reefs of the Philippines, Japanese infantry fought with terrifying discipline. But in Washington and San Diego, something was happening that the Japanese High Command had not expected. The United States was learning, and learning fast. The chaos of Pearl Harbor had forged a new generation of American officers who were forced to adapt, innovate, and improvise under pressure. They couldn't afford perfection, they had to evolve. And evolution, not calculation, would decide the war. By April 1942, the illusion of Japan's invincibility began to crack. It started with a single, symbolic event: the Doolittle Raid. 16 American B-25 bombers, stripped of weight and loaded with minimal fuel, launched from the deck of the USS Hornet, something no one had ever attempted before. Their target was Tokyo itself. The damage they inflicted was minor, militarily speaking, but its psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, Japanese citizens heard American bombs falling on their own soil. For the first time, the myth of invulnerability was shattered. Genda and Yamamoto understood what it meant. If the Americans could reach Japan this early, their industrial recovery was progressing faster than expected. Yamamoto's 6-month window, the margin Genda had calculated, was closing faster than anyone had imagined. By May 1942, Japan sought to deliver another decisive blow, one that would finish what Pearl Harbor had started. The plan was simple in theory: lure the remaining American carriers into a trap, destroy them, and secure dominance over the Pacific once and for all. The first test came at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Here, for the first time in history, opposing fleets fought without ever seeing each other. All combat was carried out by aircraft, launched from carriers hundreds of miles apart. It was a battle of intelligence, timing, and nerves. Both sides suffered losses, but tactically, the result was inconclusive. The Japanese sank one American carrier, but they lost too many irreplaceable planes and pilots. Strategically, it was the first time Japan's advance had been stopped. And it was a warning, a signal that American strategy was adapting. Genda studied the reports carefully. He recognized the trend. The United States was producing not just weapons, but methods. Radar coordination, carrier doctrine, aerial refueling techniques, all improving at a rate Japan could not match. Yamamoto's analysts believed they still had one more chance to destroy America's carriers and restore momentum. The operation would be massive, complex, and audacious, a trap built around a small atoll in the Central Pacific called Midway. In June 1942, the Japanese combined fleet, the most powerful naval force in history, set sail for Midway Island. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft. Their mission, to attack Midway, draw out the American carriers, and annihilate them. On paper, it was flawless. It bore all the hallmarks of Genda's precision: coordination, timing, deception. But the Americans were no longer reacting blindly. They had broken Japan's naval code. Admiral Chester Nimitz, armed with decrypted intelligence, knew Japan's plan almost to the hour. He placed his carriers north of Midway, hidden, waiting. What followed over the next 3 days would determine the fate of the Pacific. On June 4th, Japanese aircraft struck Midway at dawn. The initial attack succeeded. Airfields and installations were hit hard. But even as Genda's pilots returned to rearm for a second strike, reports began to flood in. Enemy carriers sighted. The timing was disastrous. Japanese decks were cluttered with refueling planes, loaded torpedoes, and live ordnance. When American dive bombers appeared out of the clouds, the result was instantaneous and catastrophic. In less than 10 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were hit, their decks engulfed in flames. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, gone. Hiryu fought on valiantly, launching counterstrikes, but was destroyed by the end of the day. Japan's elite aviators, the same men who had trained for years under Genda's doctrine, were dead or dying in the sea. The empire had lost not just ships, but its entire offensive capacity. Midway was not just a defeat. It was the turning point of the Pacific War. For Japan, it marked the end of expansion and the beginning of survival. For the United States, it was proof that intelligence, adaptability, and sheer industrial might could overcome even the most brilliant tactical design. And for Genda, it was the first moment he began to question his faith in calculation. He had built his strategy around control of timing, precision, variables. But at Midway, chaos had ruled. Human intuition, luck, and resilience had rewritten the equations he had once trusted completely. The war had entered a new phase, one that no amount of mathematics could predict. The Battle of Midway did more than sink 4 carriers. It shattered Japan's strategic calculus. For the first time in history, a major naval power realized it had lost the initiative not in battle, but in production. In the weeks following the disaster, the Imperial Navy's war rooms were silent. Maps were redrawn, supply figures rechecked, fleet lists rewritten, but no amount of reorganization could conceal the simple truth that Yamamoto and Genda now faced. Japan could no longer replace what it lost. Every fallen pilot was years of training gone. Every destroyed carrier meant months, even years, of reconstruction that Japan's shipyards could no longer sustain. And worse, the enemy was learning faster than Japan could recover. By early 1943, the United States had begun to demonstrate what total industrial mobilization really meant. Across the American heartland, factories that once built automobiles now assembled aircraft engines. Steel once used for skyscrapers now became hull plating for ships. And in the deserts of Nevada, the assembly lines of modern warfare hummed day and night. Every 8 weeks, a new Essex-class fleet carrier slid down the ways. Every few days, a Liberty ship joined the convoy routes that spanned half the globe. For every Japanese pilot trained, the United States graduated 10. For every Japanese aircraft produced, America built 12. For every Japanese carrier completed, America commissioned 4 more. And these weren't just numbers. They were an entire philosophy of war, a belief that quantity was a quality of its own. Genda knew it. He studied the production reports smuggled out through intelligence channels. He read estimates that made his stomach twist. By 1944, American shipyards would outproduce Japan by a ratio of 20-1. He had once believed precision could overcome quantity, that one perfectly executed strike was worth 10 clumsy ones. But at Midway, he'd watched precision collapse in the face of overwhelming replacement. No matter how brilliant Japan's tactics, industrial arithmetic now ruled the war. While Japan mourned its dead, American shipyards were already repairing, rebuilding, and innovating. The U.S. Navy introduced radar-guided fire control, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, and standardized repair procedures that turned crippled ships into fighting vessels again within weeks. When a Japanese carrier was hit, it was a funeral.
When an American carrier was hit, it was a maintenance problem. The difference wasn't courage, it was infrastructure. Japan's shipyards, Yokosuka, Kure, Sasebo, were cramped, bomb-prone, and dependent on imported materials. American shipyards, Norfolk, Brooklyn, Bremerton, were sprawling industrial ecosystems, supplied by endless railways, steel mills, and refineries. Every American loss was a temporary setback. Every Japanese loss was permanent. By mid-1943, Genda's doctrine, the elegant synthesis of mathematics and motion, had begun to rot from within. His pilots, once the most skilled in the world, were being replaced by half-trained recruits with less than 100 hours of flight time. Fuel shortages forced them to train on the ground with wooden mock-ups of planes they might never fly.
Maintenance crews lacked spare parts. Engines ran past service life. Aircraft were cannibalized just to keep a few airworthy. He knew what was coming, a war of attrition, not brilliance. And attrition was a war Japan could not win. At sea, the Americans began to unleash their industrial momentum in terrifying new forms. Task Force 58, an armada of Essex-class carriers, moved across the Pacific like a floating continent. Each task group could launch over 1,000 aircraft in coordinated waves that blackened the sky. They struck not just ships, but systems, fuel depots, airfields, shipyards, radio stations, transportation networks. Japan was not simply being beaten in battle. It was being dismantled as an industrial organism. In Tokyo, Genda sat in meetings that had become almost ritualistic. Admirals spoke of spirit, of sacrifice, of divine winds that might yet turn the tide. But the numbers told another story. By the start of 1944, Japan's oil reserves had fallen below critical levels. Synthetic fuel projects failed. American submarines prowled the shipping lanes, sinking tankers faster than they could be built. Every sortie now cost Japan more fuel than it could afford to replace. Every battle burned the empire's future a little faster, and the Americans knew it. Their strategy was deliberate, surgical, starve Japan's war machine before the final blow. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19, 1944, the moment the last threads of Genda's doctrine finally snapped. 9 Japanese carriers sailed under Admiral Ozawa's command, the remnant of what had once been the greatest naval aviation force in the world. Facing them, 15 American carriers, brimming with Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers, guided by radar, communication relays, and tactical control systems that no Japanese officer had even imagined possible. The Japanese launched wave after wave of attacks, 4 in total. Each one was met by radar-directed American fighters. Out of 450 aircraft launched that day, over 300 were destroyed. the Americans lost 29.
The exchange ratio, 12-1, was more than a statistic. It was the physical manifestation of industrial war.
The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese called it a tragedy. When the battle ended, Japan's naval air arm was dead. Its pilots, irreplaceable veterans, were gone.
Its carriers, the proud symbols of its empire, were either sinking or sailing home empty. Genda knew the truth before the reports reached Tokyo. Japan's war in the Pacific was effectively over. Everything after the Philippine Sea would be a long, desperate act of delay. But Japan was not a nation that surrendered easily. Even in ruin, it prepared for one final, suicidal stand. By late 1944, Japan's empire was still vast on maps, stretching from Burma to the Marshalls, from Manchuria to New Guinea. But the maps lied. Behind the black lines of occupation, the empire was hollow. Factories stood idle without fuel. Shipyards waited for steel that would never arrive. Pilots trained in the skies of Kyushu without engines that could last more than a few flight hours. The Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. It belonged to the machines of America. Every week, the U.S. Navy pushed closer. Island by island, base by base, the Americans were erasing Japan's ability to wage war. Saipan, Tinian, Guam, names that once meant nothing to most Americans, now became launching platforms for the next phase of the war, the invasion of the Japanese homeland. But before the ground was reached, there was one final battleground, Leyte Gulf. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 1944, the largest naval battle in human history. 4 separate engagements across 100,000 square miles of ocean. Over 400 ships, nearly 2,000 aircraft. Japan's strategy, a desperate deception. Admiral Ozawa's remaining carriers were ordered north with barely any aircraft aboard. They would act as bait to lure Halsey's fast carriers away from the invasion beaches in the Philippines, while the remaining Japanese surface fleet slipped in from the west to destroy the vulnerable American landing forces. It was a gamble born of despair. Japan's admirals knew their carriers could no longer fight. Their decks were nearly empty, their pilots untrained. They were sacrificial decoys, and the plan almost worked. Halsey took the bait. American aircraft annihilated Ozawa's carrier force. All 4 carriers were sunk, including Zukaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force. But the sacrifice achieved nothing. The Japanese surface fleet that broke through the San Bernardino Strait was met not by American battleships, but by small escort carriers and destroyers of Taffy 3. And yet, even that was enough. American industrial power had transformed even its smallest ships into formidable fortresses. Radar-guided fire, disciplined crews, and endless courage turned what should have been a massacre into a legend. Japan's chance for a decisive blow died in the waters of Leyte Gulf. Its navy, once the most powerful in Asia, was finished. But Japan was not ready to surrender. When ships could no longer fight, it sent men. When aircraft production lagged, it turned to sacrifice. When fuel ran out, it offered blood. Thus was born the most tragic doctrine of the modern age, the kamikaze. The rise of the kamikaze. The word means divine wind, a reference to the typhoons that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion centuries earlier. Now, it was reborn as a weapon of desperation. In October 1944, Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi proposed the unthinkable: organized suicide attacks by volunteer pilots. His logic was brutal and clear.
Japan could no longer outproduce or outfight the United States, but perhaps it could outdie it. He argued that one plane, one pilot, and one hit could destroy a carrier. If every attack killed hundreds of Americans, perhaps their will to fight would break before Japan's will to endure. The idea spread, like wildfire, through a military already on the edge of collapse. Pilots volunteered by the hundreds, some out of belief, others out of fear, and many because there was simply no other path left. They were given hastily built aircraft, sometimes stripped-down trainers filled with explosives, and a single mission: find an American ship and crash into it. From late 1944 through mid-1945, more than 3,800 kamikaze sorties were launched. They sank 34 ships, damaged 368, and killed over 4,900 American sailors. To American commanders, the attacks were horrifying, but not decisive. For every ship damaged, another was already being repaired or replaced. For every crew lost, hundreds more stood ready. The kamikaze could wound America's fleet, but it could not stop it. Meanwhile, Japan's industrial pulse was fading. By early 1945, steel output had fallen by 80%. Aircraft production, which had peaked at 28,000 in 1944, plummeted as factories were bombed and materials vanished. Oil reserves were nearly gone. The Navy had less than 3 months of fuel for combat operations. Even training flights became impossible. Pilots practiced taxiing on the ground. Mechanics used wooden mock-ups to simulate maintenance. Officers held map exercises in basements as American B-29s thundered overhead, burning the cities above them to ash. In March 1945, American carrier task forces reached the Japanese home islands themselves. Task Force 38, 17 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, unleashed waves of Hellcats and Avengers over Tokyo. Japan's once feared Zero fighters rose to meet them, but in pitiful numbers and piloted by boys barely out of school. They were slaughtered in minutes. The airspace over Japan now belonged entirely to the United States Navy. By summer, Japan had no operational carriers left, no fuel, no pilots, no industrial future. The divine wind could not save them this time. The Empire's last breath came not with a final victory, but with the quiet understanding that the age of the battleship and the samurai spirit had been buried beneath the roar of mass production, the machines that ended empires. When the war began, Japan's carrier force had been an elite in 6 world-class vessels, crafted with precision and pride. By war's end, the United States Navy had commissioned over 130 carriers, fleet, light, and escort combined. What had taken Japan 2 decades to build, America achieved in less than 4 years. Japan's entire naval philosophy, quality over quantity, spirit over material, had met its opposite in the American system, the industrialization of victory. In the final months, Japanese admirals knew the truth. Vice Admiral Ozawa himself admitted before the war's end, "We were beaten before the first battle, by steel, by oil, by industry." Admiral Yamamoto had predicted it even earlier. "I can run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, I have no confidence." He was right, almost to the day. By the 7th month, Japan was already losing. By the 3rd year, it was drowning. When we speak of the Pacific War, we often picture aircraft dogfights, jungle battles, or islands burning beneath naval bombardment. But in truth, the war was decided far from any battlefield. In places like Detroit, Richmond, and Mobile, in the thunder of presses, the hiss of welders, and the endless rhythm of shift whistles, the real front line of World War II was the American factory floor. The arsenal of democracy comes alive. Even before the United States officially entered the war, its industrial leaders saw what was coming. By mid-1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had declared, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." At the time, America's Navy ranked third in the world. Its fleet was formidable, but nowhere near the scale required to fight two oceans at once. So Washington did something extraordinary. It didn't just expand production, it reinvented it. Car manufacturers became aircraft builders. Steel companies turned to ship hulls. Appliance factories retooled for torpedoes. And in less than 3 years, a dormant economy transformed into a military ecosystem. The miracle of mass shipbuilding. Before the war, building a carrier or battleship was an art. Slow, precise, often taking years. But Henry J. Kaiser, a man with no naval experience, changed that forever. Kaiser was not a traditional shipbuilder. He was a construction magnate who had helped build dams and bridges. He looked at shipbuilding not as craftsmanship, but as assembly line engineering. His vision: if a car could be built in hours, a ship could be built in weeks. So he created a system that shocked the old Navy establishment. He divided ship construction into prefabricated sections, built simultaneously in different workshops. These massive sections were then welded together, not riveted, drastically reducing build time and cost. Welding was controversial at first. Many officers distrusted it, but Kaiser proved them wrong. At his Richmond shipyards in California, Liberty ships rolled off the lines in record numbers, one every few days, sometimes faster. The record: a fully functional cargo ship. The SS Robert E. Peary, built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. It wasn't just speed, it was scalability. Kaiser's methods could be replicated anywhere. By 1943, America had 18 major shipyards producing more than 40 million tons of shipping per year. Enough to replace every vessel lost and still grow the fleet exponentially, from Liberty ships to escort carriers. As the Pacific War intensified, America needed not just cargo ships, but floating airfields. The Navy required a new class of small, fast, and affordable carriers to protect convoys and support amphibious invasions. Kaiser took the challenge. Using merchant ship hulls as the foundation, his yards produced the Casablanca-class escort carriers, 50 in total, each capable of carrying up to 30 aircraft. They were smaller, slower, and more vulnerable than fleet carriers, but there were dozens of them. Together they became the unsung heroes of the Pacific, providing constant air cover for convoys, rescuing downed pilots, and launching attacks on Japanese submarines and island defenses. At Leyte Gulf, these very escort carriers, the so-called Taffy 3, stood against Japan's last battleships and won. That victory wasn't just courage, it was production made flesh. The carrier explosion. At the beginning of the war, Japan held a terrifying advantage in carrier aviation. 6 fleet carriers, all battle-tested. America had only 7. By 1945, the numbers told a different story. Japan, 16 carriers built, most lost. United States, over 130 carriers in service. This wasn't a miracle. It was industrial math. American shipyards could now launch a carrier every 2 weeks. Each one carried more planes, more armor, better radar, and trained pilots backed by an endless support network. Japan, by contrast, could no longer even fuel its remaining ships. By the war's final year, many Japanese carriers sat motionless in harbors, floating coffins without fuel or aircraft to launch.
Women of the war, the hidden workforce. Another secret weapon of American production wasn't steel or oil. It was people, particularly women. By 1944, over 6 million American women were working in factories. They built engines, welded hulls, and assembled wings. They tested bomb fuses and loaded ammunition. Rosie the Riveter wasn't propaganda. She was a portrait of reality. In some shipyards, over half the workforce was female. They faced grueling hours and dangerous conditions, but their work changed history. Without them, America's output would have fallen short, and the war's end might have been delayed by years. When the first Essex-class carriers sailed into combat, they carried more than planes. They carried the effort of an entire nation united behind an idea: that tyranny could be beaten by teamwork. The Essex-class revolution. The Essex-class carrier deserves special mention. It was the backbone of America's naval air power from 1943 onward, a perfect blend of speed, strength, and flexibility. 24 of these giants were built during the war. Each could carry over 90 aircraft, with a crew of nearly 3,000 men. They were faster than Japanese carriers, more heavily armored, and equipped with advanced radar and damage control systems that kept them alive even after brutal hits. Unlike Japan, which built a few elite ships one at a time, the U.S. produced Essex carriers like clockwork, one after another, standardized, efficient, and replaceable. When Japan lost a carrier, it was gone forever. When America lost one, another was already en route. That was the difference between a martial empire and an industrial civilization. The numbers that ended the war. Let's look at the raw figures, because numbers here tell the story of inevitability. Category: Japan, 1939 to 1945. United States, 1941 to 1945. Aircraft produced: 76,000. 324,000. Naval ships built: 1,500, 6,700 plus. Merchant tonnage: 3 million tons, 38 million tons. Oil refined annually: 2 million barrels, 180 million barrels. Those numbers weren't just statistics, they were destiny. Japan was fighting a war of willpower. America was fighting a war of systems. And in modern warfare, systems always win. By late 1944, the tide of war had turned irreversibly. Japan was cornered, its empire shrinking, its navy crippled, its skies dark with American bombers. But though defeat loomed, surrender was still unthinkable to the Japanese high command. For them, the concept of honor outweighed survival, and so began the bloodiest, most desperate phase of the Pacific War, a storm of fire and steel, where every inch of ground was paid for in blood. February 1945. 8 square miles of volcanic rock, Iwo Jima, became the most fiercely contested battlefield of the entire war. On paper, it seems simple: seize the island, gain an emergency landing field for B-29 bombers, and move closer to Japan's mainland. But beneath its black sand, the Japanese had prepared a fortress. Over 21,000 soldiers, commanded by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, waited in silence. No trenches, no open bunkers. Instead, they built a complex of underground tunnels stretching nearly 15 miles, linking artillery, machine gun nests, and hidden barracks. When the first U.S. Marines landed, they met nothing. No fire, no resistance. Then the island erupted. Hidden guns opened up in perfect coordination. It wasn't a defense, it was an ambush crafted to kill as many Americans as possible before the inevitable fall.
For 36 days,
Marines clawed their way across the island. The ground itself was treacherous. Volcanic ash swallowed their boots and made foxholes collapse.
every cave had to be cleared by hand. Every meter cost lives.
Out of 70,000 Marines who landed, nearly 26,000 were killed or wounded. The Japanese fought literally to the last man. Only 216 survived. And yet, even amid the carnage, a symbol rose. 5 Marines and a Navy corpsman planted the American flag atop Mount Suribachi, a moment immortalized in one photograph that came to define the entire war. But behind that image lay a haunting truth. Iwo Jima was not a victory, it was a warning. If such slaughter awaited on a mere speck of volcanic rock, what horrors would come when the Allies reached Japan itself? Just 2 months later, in April 1945, came Okinawa, the largest and deadliest battle of the Pacific Campaign. The island was Japan's final defensive outpost, only 350 miles from the mainland. Both sides knew this would be the gateway to the end, or the apocalypse. The United States assembled the largest amphibious force in human history. 1,300 ships, 1,500 aircraft, and 500,000 men. Facing them were 120,000 Japanese troops and thousands of civilians caught in the crossfire. The Japanese strategy was clear. They could not stop the invasion, but they could make it so costly that America might think twice about invading the home islands. From caves and ridges, Japanese forces fought with fanatical resolve. American firepower obliterated hills. But new defenses emerged beneath the rubble. Entire units were wiped out, yet no one surrendered. And then came the sky. For the first time in warfare, the Japanese unleashed an entirely new weapon, one born of desperation and devotion. The kamikaze, divine wind. Young pilots, some barely 18, took off in aircraft loaded with explosives, knowing they would never return. Their mission? To crash directly into American ships. Over 1,900 kamikaze attacks were launched during Okinawa alone. Nearly 5,000 American sailors were killed. Destroyers and carriers burned across the horizon. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later describe it as the most furious battle of the war, a typhoon of steel. Okinawa cost the U.S. 49,000 casualties. Japan lost over 100,000 soldiers and nearly as many civilians, many of whom were driven to suicide by propaganda that portrayed Americans as monsters. When Okinawa finally fell in June 1945, Japan was broken, but not beaten. Its armies still held the home islands, its generals still vowed resistance, and its people had been told to die before surrender. While soldiers bled on Okinawa, the machine behind them roared louder than ever. In 1945, America's war economy hit its zenith. Every 63 minutes, a new aircraft rolled off a U.S. assembly line. Every day, new ships slid into the water. Trains, trucks, fuel, ammunition. Everything flowed toward one final purpose: invasion. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, would have been the largest military operation in human history. Initial estimates predicted 1 million Allied casualties and up to 10 million Japanese deaths. Every factory in America was working toward that date. New landing craft, new tanks. Millions of Purple Heart medals were even pre-produced, in grim anticipation of the losses to come. So many were minted, in fact, that the U.S. still uses those same medals today. But even as the invasion machine gathered momentum, another project, small, secret, and utterly world-changing, was nearing completion. In hidden laboratories across America, from Los Alamos to Oak Ridge,
Thousands of scientists and engineers were working under one purpose: to harness the power of the atom. They didn't know if it would work. They didn't even know if it would destroy the world. But on July 16th, 1945, at 5:29 a.m., in the New Mexico desert, the sky turned white. The first nuclear explosion in history, the Trinity test, shattered the dawn. Witnesses described it as a second sun. Physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer whispered words from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The test was a success, and with it, the end of the war had already been written. President Harry S. Truman now faced the most terrible choice in human history: invade Japan and lose millions, or unleash a weapon unlike anything mankind had ever seen. Even after Okinawa, Japan refused to surrender. Its generals planned mass mobilization, training civilians with bamboo spears. They prepared for annihilation, but not defeat. So, on August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island, its target, Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., a single bomb, Little Boy, fell from the sky. 43 seconds later, a city vanished. 70,000 people died instantly. By year's end, the toll exceeded 140,000. 3 days later, Nagasaki, Fat Man, another 70,000 souls gone. For the first time, humanity witnessed total war made absolute. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through Japan's radios. For the first time in history, his people heard him speak. He said the words no one thought possible. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. It was surrender. The guns fell silent. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, Japan signed the instrument of surrender. The Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history, was over. The price was almost beyond comprehension. Over 70 million dead worldwide. Cities burned, nations broken, families scattered. From Nanjing to Nagasaki, from Stalingrad to Dresden, civilization had walked through fire, but the lessons endured. Technology had won, but so had mass production, organization, and a democratic society's ability to mobilize its people. Japan, devastated, would rise again within a generation, not through conquest, but through industry and innovation. And America, for all its losses, emerged as the most powerful nation in human history. August 1945. Japan was a nation of ashes. Every major city lay in ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were flattened. Tokyo had been firebombed into oblivion. And industrial centers, once vital to the empire's war machine, were gone. Railroads were twisted metal. Ports were clogged with the skeletons of ships. Factories were shattered shells. But the true devastation wasn't just physical. It was psychological. The idea of the divine emperor, the myth of invincibility, the pride of an empire that had once conquered half of Asia, all lay broken. Yet within that humiliation was the seed of transformation. General Douglas MacArthur, supreme commander of Allied powers, began an occupation that was unlike any in history. He didn't come to enslave Japan. He came to rebuild it. Under his direction, Japan underwent sweeping reforms. The military was disbanded. A new constitution was written, guaranteeing democracy and human rights. Women gained the right to vote. Land reforms broke the power of feudal landlords. Education was overhauled to teach science, democracy, and critical thinking instead of militarism and myth. Most astonishingly, Article 9 of Japan's new constitution renounced war itself, declaring that Japan would never again maintain military forces for aggression. For a nation that had worshipped the sword, This was an unthinkable transformation. But it worked. With its military abolished, Japan poured its energy into something else: industry. Factories that once built aircraft and tanks began building cars, ships, and electronics. Skilled engineers and craftsmen, now unemployed soldiers of the industrial kind, turned their discipline to peaceful creation. The Japanese government, aided by American financial aid through the Dodge Plan, and guided by economists like Joseph Dodge, stabilized the economy. Then came the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, and with it, a miracle. The U.S. military, fighting in Korea, needed supplies, and Japan was right next door. American contracts flooded Japanese factories with orders for steel, vehicles, textiles, and electronics. In just a few years, Japan's economy roared back to life. From 1955 to 1973, Japan's GDP grew at an average of 10% per year, the fastest sustained growth in human history at that time. Companies like Mitsubishi, Hitachi, Toyota, and Sony rose from the ashes of war to become global titans. By the 1970s, Japan had transformed from a defeated empire into the world's second-largest economy. What Japan failed to achieve through conquest, it achieved through capitalism and innovation. The sword had become the circuit board. Across the Pacific, the United States emerged from the war with its homeland untouched and its industry at full throttle. It had built the world's most powerful navy, the largest economy, and, now, the atomic bomb. In 1945, America produced half of the world's industrial output. Its factories, once dedicated to tanks and planes, shifted seamlessly to consumer goods. Automobiles, refrigerators, radios, homes. The tools of peace replaced the weapons of war. The GI Bill sent millions of veterans to college, creating the most educated workforce in the world. Suburbs exploded outward from every city. A new middle class was born, and with it, the American dream. But power carries a shadow. The same technology that ended the war now defined the next one, the Cold War. The Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, became its ideological enemy. Where World War II had been fought with battleships and bombers, this new war was fought with spies, ideology, and fear. The race to build more powerful atomic weapons began immediately. In 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. In 1952, the U.S. detonated the first hydrogen bomb, 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima. In 1955, the Soviets followed suit. The logic of war had changed forever. Victory was now impossible because total victory meant total extinction. The skies over the Pacific, once filled with aircraft carriers and bombers, were now shadowed by intercontinental missiles and nuclear submarines. Yet beneath the arms race, one lesson remained constant, the same lesson the Pacific War had taught so brutally. Wars are not won by heroism alone, they are won by capacity. By 1945, the U.S. had built over 300,000 aircraft, 90,000 tanks, and 1,200 major warships. Japan's total output in the same period was a fraction of that. Steel, oil, labor, logistics. These, not slogans or spirit, decide the fate of nations. When Japan ran out of oil, their carriers became useless. When they ran out of trained pilots, their Zeros became suicide weapons. When their factories were bombed, their fleet could no longer sail. The empire had collapsed not from lack of courage, but from lack of capacity. And that truth echoed into the new age. Industry is strategy. Technology is destiny. Even amid prosperity, the shadows of Hiroshima and Nagasaki never faded. The atomic bomb had ended the war, but it had also opened a moral wound that would never fully heal. For decades, Japanese survivors,
the hibakusha, lived with radiation sickness, stigma, and silence. Their stories were too painful, too political. It took years before Japan began to openly confront its dual identity as both aggressor and victim. Nagasaki and Hiroshima became not symbols of defeat, but of remembrance. Eternal warnings carved into history. In America, too, there was reflection. Had the bomb been necessary? Could Japan have surrendered without it? Historians still debate that question. But to those who fought and those who watched millions die, the answer seemed simple. It ended the killing. It ended the unthinkable. Out of the ashes of the Pacific War rose something extraordinary, an alliance. The former enemies, Japan and the United States, became partners. In 1951, the Treaty of San Francisco formally ended the occupation. In 1960, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty bound the two nations in mutual defense. American bases remained on Japanese soil, not as conquerors, but as guarantors of peace. Together, they forged a new Pacific world, one built on trade, cooperation, and shared prosperity. Japan, once the sword of Asia, became its engineer. America, once the arsenal of democracy, became the guardian of a new order. And through that uneasy peace, the world entered the atomic age, a time when war was no longer the ultimate expression of power, but the ultimate failure of it. 80 years later, the lessons remain. Nations still rise and fall not on the strength of their armies, but on the strength of their industries. Technology still defines the battlefield before the first shot is fired, and history still whispers the same warning. The side that can outbuild, outthink, and outlast wins. World War II was not just a war of men and machines. It was a war of systems, and the American system, for all its flaws, proved unstoppable. Japan's tragedy and America's triumph became two halves of the same story, a story of transformation, of power, and of what humanity becomes when it decides that survival is not enough. It must also rebuild. The war that began with arrogance and ambition ended with silence and smoke. Yet out of that silence, humanity built something extraordinary. Not just nations rebuilt, but lessons learned at a cost too high to measure. The story of Japan and the United States in the Pacific is not just a chronicle of destruction. It's a study in transformation, of how two nations, born of the same century, reached the pinnacle of war, only to find a mirror in each other's reflection. For Japan, the war was a tragedy of brilliance misdirected, of engineers who created miracles of machinery but served an empire blind to its own limits. For America, it was a trial by fire, a test of democracy's promise that free people, united by will and work, could outfight any tyranny on earth. Factories became arsenals, citizens became soldiers, dreamers became builders, and in the end, what won the war wasn't the bomb, or the general, or even the courage of the soldier. It was the factory worker in Detroit, the welder in Richmond, the shipyard woman in Newport News, and the farmer feeding a nation and an army at once. It was an entire civilization turned toward one purpose, survival through creation. That was America's true weapon, not destruction, but production. The belief that no matter the loss, something stronger could be built in its place. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the generation that had fought the greatest war in history returned to rebuild a world that had nearly destroyed itself. They built highways and hospitals, universities and industries. They built peace, not because they had forgotten war, but because they remembered it too vividly. The Pacific, once an ocean of death, became a bridge of commerce and culture. American and Japanese engineers,
would one day stand side by side, building cars.
Electronics, even space technology. The same nations that once burned each other's cities would launch satellites together. That is the real legacy of the Pacific War. Not the bombs or the battles, but the understanding that power without purpose leads only to ashes. Every generation thinks it's too wise to repeat history. Every empire believes it can outlast its mistakes, and every time, history humbles them. The Pacific War reminds us that no nation, no matter how proud, is immune to the laws of industrial and moral gravity. When you forget what you're fighting for, you lose, even if you win. When you remember why you build, you endure, even if you fall. That's the paradox of the 20th century's greatest war. Japan lost the empire, but found its soul. America won the war, but inherited the burden of power. Both emerged changed, both built anew. And together, they gave the modern world its blueprint for survival. Progress through creation, not conquest. In the end, the story of the Pacific War is not about who had the biggest fleet or the deadliest weapon. It's about who could learn faster, build smarter, and endure longer. It's about the victory of resilience over rage, of factories over fantasies, of democracy over destiny. History is not just memory. It's warning. And for those who listen, it still speaks to you. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that history's greatest battles were fought not just on seas and skies, but in shipyards and factories, then you're part of a community that refuses to let these lessons fade. Subscribe for more true stories of World War II, told with the depth, detail, and respect they deserve. Each week, we uncover the moments that textbooks forget, the innovations that shaped nations, and the human choices that changed everything. Stay with us, because history doesn't repeat, it instructs, and together, we'll keep remembering what the world too often forgets, that freedom is built, not given, and peace is earned, not inherited. Watch next, The Battle of Midway, the day the Pacific turned. A story of strategy, fate, and the 4 minutes that changed the world.